That's one thing that I wish I would have known when I started was it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to not know anything.
Welcome to the Food Grads Podcast, the podcast that takes you on a fascinating journey into the hearts and minds of the amazing people who work in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. My name is Veronica, and I am a PhD candidate studying fat-based food emulsions. On this podcast, we share insights from professionals at all stages of their careers. Find out what they do, why they do it, and how they are changing the food world one day at a time. So no matter what your passion is, there's always something for everyone in food, and we'll help you find it. Hello everyone, it's Veronica. Welcome back to the Food Grads Podcast. On today's episode, we are talking about what a food processing plant manager does, servant leadership, and transitioning into a leadership position as a young person. Our guest today is Gavin Johnston, plant manager at Veg Pro International Inc. and owner of Redpath Strategies. Veg Pro International is a recognized leader in the innovative farming and processing of lettuce and vegetables. They are known under the brand name Fraîche, and their pre-washed lettuces are available in major grocery chains. Gavin is a manufacturing leader with success in servant leadership, business transformation, strategic planning, and operational excellence. He has extensive segment experience in the hospitality industry, snack foods, high and low acidic beverages, bakery ingredients, dairy manufacturing, pet food manufacturing, and supply chain. He is a firm believer in continuous improvement at all levels, from C-suite executives to manufacturing operators. This episode of the podcast is powered by Careers Now. Careers Now is Food and Beverage Ontario's multi-year workforce development initiative that is connecting students and job seekers with employers in Ontario's food and beverage processing industry for exciting career opportunities. Check out careersnow.ca for more information on exciting jobs, career information, industry mentors, and training opportunities for professional development. Hello, Gavin. How are you doing today?
Hi, Veronica. I'm doing good.
Excellent. I'm so happy that you are going to be able to come on the show. Somehow, some way, I've managed to get to this many episodes of the podcast, and I've not had a plant manager come on the show, which is one of the jobs that I'm always trying to promote. So I'm so happy to have you on the show, and thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm looking forward to giving my perspective on what a plant manager does.
Perfect. Well, with that being said, I guess we can just dive right into it. Let's first talk about you, and let's first talk about where you work. So tell us a little bit more about VegPro.
So VegPro. I've been here actually. This is a really good time to interview because this is my week number 7 at VegPro. So I'm a brand new hire. So just to give you a little bit of context with VegPro, they were a company. So they're Canada's largest vegetable producer, and they started back in the 90s. So there's 3 manufacturing plants that the company has. They have one in Sherrington in Quebec, which is their biggest facility and their original. They have one in BC, the plant in BC that I run, and there's one in Florida. So they typically do in the plant that I run here, they do a lot of leafy greens. So if you go to Save-On Foods or Costco or Walmart and you see the like spring mix kits, we produce that. So we have farms on our manufacturing sites are adjacent to. And so we harvest, we cultivate, we harvest, and then we package the leafy greens. So yeah, and so that's basically it in a nutshell. And then we have a plant down in Florida as well that they do the same. They do leafy veg and also root vegetables.
Wow, that's amazing. That's
Yeah,
so cool to have the growing on the facilities, but I will say from personal experience, I'm very familiar with your products. I do eat them, so that's
good.
awesome.
That's awesome.
One of the reasons I wanted to get you on the show is again because you're a plant manager. So, would you be able to speak to that role and what that entails?
Sure. So that's the nicest thing about about the job title as plant manager is, and I think every plant manager will agree with me that no day is the same. Every day is different. So, but at a high level, typically the average plant manager would have kind of full responsibility of profit and loss, so P&L responsibility for the performance of the manufacturing site. So in my role, that would be the same in my role, and then also the plant manager would lead different managers in the plant. So, a plant typically comprises of a food plant typically comprises of a team that has a quality manager, a warehouse manager, a maintenance manager, and a production manager. So the plant manager is basically responsible for making sure the plant is performing to the expectations, but also that the managers are performing to their goals and objectives as well.
Okay. So, like you mentioned, is that the no 2 days are the same. And I can also say that it is correct that plant managers' roles will vary depending on the size of the company because you have one facility, they might be the plant manager, but also the production manager, and then everything else. But once you get to a more, maybe larger company, these roles start to become more like a leadership role, maybe less tangible.
Correct. So, I mean, that's in my career so far. I've worked for both. I've worked for smaller sort of startups where I've been the I've been the production manager, and I've also, in the same process, I've been taking pallets out of a truck. So I've had many, many hats. And then with this role now, it's a larger organization. So the roles are definitely more defined in terms of responsibilities. So in my role, the average day would when I come into the plant, usually I do a walk around with my team. I check in with the sector managers and then making sure that the day is starting well, any issues that have to be addressed for the startup. And then I would, after that, take a walk on the floor, on the shop floor, and check in with the employees. So that would be the average morning. And then obviously, as the day progresses, you're brought into different meetings. So for instance, my this week here, I have meetings on talking about plant efficiencies, talking about capacity planning. So what does next year look like in terms of new customers coming on board?
Wow. Wow. You say it so simply, but at the same time, I can imagine there's so many moving parts that I've always thought this role seems like one that's so difficult to do because there's the day to day that you have to keep up with the production of the day, but then there's also this long term planning that also has to be implementing and balancing the two. I can imagine can be quite difficult.
Right. Yeah, and that's another good thing as well. Well, another challenging thing is, part of a plant manager role is you have to prepare for future states, but in the manufacturing environment, there's never a good time to make change. Even right now, in my current role, we have to plan further down the line is how do we, get more customers, get more volume. At the same time, you have a sales team that are going out and aggressively getting new customers. So you have to plan for the future, but then you also have to make sure that your plant is ready to react to new volume coming in right away. And that's why I say like no 2 day is the same because every day there's a different challenge, there's a different opportunity.
That sounds like an exciting role. And I wanted to take it a step back, though, and talk about how you got here, because from my understanding, you got a degree in food science. And I feel many individuals who go into that profession, or pardon me, go into that education, have dreams to become food scientists. Now, that might have been the case for you or may not have been. Would you be able to walk us through a little bit why you decided to get into this field and maybe some key steps that have been along the way?
Yeah, so and it'll be interesting because I am the furthest from a food scientist as you would imagine. So, and one of the funny elements was when I graduated, I remember having a conversation with my microbiology professor, and he had told me at the time that if you get a job in a lab when you go out into the workforce, I will deny all evidence that you ever came to this college because I wasn't a science focused student. I wanted to so part of the sorry, I'll back up. Sorry. I studied food science at the Scottish Agricultural College. So at the time in the early 2000s, food science wasn't really wasn't really a popular subject, and I'm not too sure why, but it wasn't really a popular subject. So there wasn't a lot of like my class in Scotland. I was with four students. So in the whole of Scotland,
Oh
there
my
was four
gosh.
students doing food science and technology. But at the time, the course was food science and technology. So I was more interested in the technology slash engineering side.
Okay.
And yeah, and previous to that, just to back up a little bit further, I was never really academic, so I got my high school certificates, but I never really got enough to progress into university. So after I left high school, I didn't really know what to do. And at the time, I was working as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and I always liked food. So I went to my local community college, and I got what's the British equivalent of a Red Seal. So I got a Red Seal certification in culinary arts. So I spent 3 years learning how to be a chef, and that kind of stood me in good stead for the start of my career. And that 3 years studying culinary arts kind of propelled me into getting a placement at the food science program in Scotland. Yeah, and then and kind of interestingly enough, like my father, my dad's been in the food industry for probably a good part of 40 years, just over 40 years now. So he went to the same college, the same campus, the same school. So I was, when I was in my first and second year in university, I was using the same equipment that he would have been using in the mid 70s.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's sorry, I'm having flashbacks to my own university when we were
Yeah.
still using some chemistry equipment from the 60s.
Love it.
Oh wow. Okay, so that makes a little bit more sense. It again, you are right. Food science has definitely grown in the past, I'd say decade. Even when I applied for food science in high school, it wasn't really well known. Like there was definitely there. I feel it's maybe just the shifting dynamic of switching off of food being treated more of the food processing, and then you had the agricultural side. So if people thought of going into food, they would think egg or chef. So that makes sense. It's kind of funny to hear your professor tell you that. Usually you would have professors that are very encouraging, but I guess
Well,
here we are.
and that's the best thing about where I went to. Like I said, I had four students in my class, and it was a smaller campus, and it was an agricultural campus. So on where I went to university, there was ag science, there was sports science. We had active farms, so we have a dairy farm, chicken processing facility. So it was very it was very agricultural based, and the classes weren't massive. So I think the biggest class size I had was maybe 50 or 60 students. So so the professors and the college and the teachers, they kind of all they knew everybody. So there was a kind of close knitness to it. So when I say about the professor, like we were pretty we had a pretty good relationship, and so we kind of knew he knew my strength, and he knew my weakness. So it was it was a fun time to be a part of that college. So
That's wonderful. I think that's still a little bit the case with a lot of food science programs now today, that it is on the smaller side, just it's kind of how it is. I feel it's growing for sure. There's definitely more universities and colleges that are starting to offer these types of programs, but I think that's great that you can have it really goes to show how your university or college life can really play a role in how you have those relationships with your professors and being able to speak with them. You might have not gone in a certain path had you not had those conversations.
right, exactly. And that's the one thing that I've always been puzzled with is, and for students listening to this podcast is I was encouraged to get into the food manufacturing business because my dad said that it's pretty much a recession proof industry. So if you if you're able to get a job in the food industry, you have a job for life. And I've certainly witnessed that in my, I've been working now for, it's probably going to be 20 years. So I'm kind of, not midway through my career, but, I've always experienced being able to have a job in the food industry. So, and specifically, I have experience in the dairy industry. So, my dad was in the dairy industry for most of his working life. And I spent the good part of 8 or 9 years in the dairy industry. That is for sure, I would call it a recession proof, especially milk, a recession proof industry. And so I've always wondered, where's the gap between getting more students to do food science and encouraging it in high school and opening it up as a really good, viable career choice.
Well, that's here where Food Grads is trying to help bridge that gap there because I think the only reason I came into contact with food science, even though I did do a chemistry degree, but the whole food industry was watching the Food Network. And then there was also this one show called Recipe to Riches. And it was this show where home cooks it was done through President's Choice, and home cooks could give in their recipes that they could get it commercialized, become a product of PC, and they would show behind the test kitchens and the R&D. And it never occurred to me that, oh, these are the individuals that are making the foods. Now, of course, it's the product development side, but then it kind of opened my eyes, all these different things on television. And I kind of put the pieces together. But when I was in high school, no one ever told me. There was no guidance counselors. I kind of figured it out on my own.
Right. And it's funny, I had the same when I left high school, and I'm going, oh my goodness, I don't have enough credits to get into university. What the heck am I going to do? Am I going to be a dishwasher the rest of my life? And so I was trying to figure out what am I going to do? And that's when I had the conversation with my dad, is saying, his words were, well, I went to university in this place on the west coast of Scotland. You should check it out if it's still there. And lo and behold, it was still there. But nobody ever sat me down and said, hey, there's lots of good jobs and good good professions in the food industry. So it's definitely it's a challenge that I think the food industry should be tackling more, is getting into high schools and showing students that there are so not just plant manager roles, but there's so many variety of roles in the food industry.
For sure. I definitely have to agree. And again, I hope Food Grads is going to help tackle that.
Yeah.
But bringing the conversation back onto you, because again, you mentioned that you have done a lot of work in dairy. You've done plant supervisor and such. I wanted to talk about just the feelings, or like how did those first roles come to be? Like, how did you find you decided you wanted to go into becoming a plant supervisor? What choices did you make that this was something you wanted to try? And then maybe you could walk us through what a starting off plant manager might look like, someone new in their career.
Okay. So I'll start with the first question. So what got me into being a plant supervisor? Well, I came to Canada from Northern Ireland in 2006, I believe. And at the time, coming into Canada, I just needed to get a job. So, as I said, the food industry, you always have a job. So I went back to my roots and got a job at Cactus Club as a chef. So I I chefed there for probably about 6 or 7 months, and then I was able to get a position in the food manufacturing industry as the R&D manager for a company called at the time it was called Sandell Foods, and they their their product was they made glacé cherries and pie fillings for Save on Foods or Safeways. It's kind of like the bulk apple pie fillings.
Hmm.
And so I got a job there as the R&D manager, and I was there for about 2 years, and which is good because it kind of, it that role really focused on my culinary skills, on how to develop recipes and how to scale them up and whatnot. But there was always something missing that I believed I wanted to keep trying. Like I wanted to try something new, and I wanted to lead people, and I didn't have an opportunity at the time to kind of lead a team at that role. And the interesting thing about that role was when I was an R&D manager was the company was going through a bit of a transformation. They had bought a manufacturing plant in another city, and they were just in the process of moving. So as a young manager, I was brought into to management meetings at the time that involved decisions that were being made on how to move the manufacturing facility, and the timelines, the budgets, and that kind of ignited my interest in leadership. So, I started looking, and there was an opportunity to be a plant supervisor for a dairy plant in Burnaby, British Columbia. And so I interviewed, and of course, I didn't think I was going to get the role because I didn't have any experience. And luckily, the plant manager there, and somebody, his name is Jeff Sonnefeld, and he was, he was a pretty good mentor when I was working at the dairy plant. And I guess I had a good interview because I got the role. And so I spent a good part of 5 or 6 years as plant supervisor. And that's what really kicked off my interest in leading a manufacturing facility, because as a supervisor, I think one of the hardest, most challenging roles anyone can do in the food industry is being a plant supervisor, because you have to have a good balance of keeping the hourly employees happy and making sure that they're performing well and they have a lot of support. But then you're also stuck in the middle where you have to keep the management happy. So I had many great years as a supervisor, but I definitely wanted to keep moving up the ladder, because I couldn't see myself doing it for, longer than what I was doing it for. And then what was the second question was, now that I've been talking too much.
I was so caught into your story that I'm just
Yeah.
waiting for the next. What's that pivotal moment? But no, I was, I was asking about how was it being so for many going into a leadership role? Is that something new?
Mhm.
How did you develop those skills? So you mentioned that middleman keeping everyone happy.
Yeah.
How did you develop those skills, and what exactly are they? Like keeping someone happy is it's not a very tangible thing to say. So
Yeah.
my question is, what skills did you build and how did you do them as someone who was new?
Well, the best advice I ever got on that was ask way too many questions. When I went into, so I was actually, as a good, I'll backtrack. My first week or week and a half of being a supervisor, a plant supervisor, I was almost ready to quit because I was so overwhelmed with what the responsibilities entailed. So, my first couple of days, I was kind of shadowing the lead supervisor, and it was a very intense first impression of what a supervisor does, but it was focused on seeing what the supervisors do for managing schedules. There was a lot of Excel work, there's a lot of efficiency calculations. And this was my first real exposure to any sort of, how do we report performance. And so I was 100% overwhelmed with all the responsibilities. I thought I was just going to be able to tell people what to do, and that was it. But going in and shadowing that lead supervisor, and knowing that I have to be the one that goes in and reports all the line efficiencies for the day, making sure that if somebody calls in sick, I have to go through a list of people that I have to call. And so the role entailed way more than I originally thought. Uh, and I honestly thought that I wouldn't make it as a plant supervisor, and I was ready to give up within the first week. For sure, I was ready to give up. But I kept learning. I kept going back to the phrase, ask way too many questions, and I asked questions, and I annoyed a lot of people. And that was one part that really helped for me, is I was just the annoying guy that asked a lot of questions. But then the other the other part that I really enjoyed was, if I didn't know something, I would just go on the floor and just ask the employees, how do we do it? And that's another tricky subject in the food industry as well. Any manufacturing industry is, if you go in as supervisor, it depends on what workforce you're in. So when I was a plant supervisor, we had a union, so the hourly employees were part of a union. So there's also that level of complexity where, as a new supervisor, you have to know your guides of where you go for supervising. But I would just spend a ton of time on the floor with the operators, asking a lot of questions, and just having the luxury of being the new guy, and having a license to ask those questions, right?
Right. That's really good advice in terms of asking questions, and it goes to show that you really can't, if you don't know something, you shouldn't fake, like there's a level of confidence, but at the same time, if you really can't, and you have to just ask questions.
Yeah, and that's another element that, as you later in your career, as you develop and you forge relationships and you get a little bit more confidence, that's one thing that I wish I would have known when I started, was it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to not know anything. Like when I was a young supervisor, or even a manager, like if I think back 2 or 3 positions ago, when I was, mid 20s and I was a manager, I still went into that job thinking I was God's gift to the manufacturing plant, and I was I was making judgments thinking that I knew what I was talking about, and sometimes I didn't know what the heck was going on. Uh, so, as you reflect on your career as you go through it, there's things that you experience that knowing if you knew that going in starting, you could see that if you knew that when you were a young supervisor, it would have opened up a lot more doors. But of course, that's the luxury of living a life and having a career, is you learn these things as you progress.
Hello, everyone. Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our friends at Durham College. With campuses in Oshawa and Whitby, Durham College offers access to more than 140 full time and part time programs in a number of different disciplines, allowing you to develop the skills required to meet the demands of today's job market. Inspired by today's episode with Gavin, I particularly wanted to point out Durham College's facility of hospitality and horticultural science. Gavin had mentioned how important it is to ask questions in order to grow your career, and you can ask all the questions that you want right at Durham without having to leave the campus. If you were to study at Durham College, you would learn field to fork and sustainable business practices at their W. Galen Weston Center of Food. There, you would have access to 2 greenhouses and a post harvest facility, an indoor vertical farm, pollinator gardens, aquaponics, an apple orchard, a food forest, a summer farmers market, a food and beverage pairing lab, a culinary demonstration lecture theater, plus so much more that I had to shorten this list to fit it in the time slot. If you're interested to learn more about Durham College and their amazing programs, then head over to the Education Partners tab on the Food Grads website and click on Durham College. Or you can simply check out the show notes in this episode. Thank you for that. Let's jump right back into the episode. I'm still going through mine. I'm still obviously going through my career and such, and I know that asking questions is important. I do always try to be humble with things, but I can understand sometimes where you do feel, well, I know this, and
Mhm.
you really don't.
Yeah, and the flip side of that as well is, it's important when we talk about leadership. It's very important that you also have a manager who allows you to ask lots of questions, who allows you to feel comfortable with saying I don't, you know, and that kind of gets some of the key people in my life. They've always, they've been people who are willing to say, it's okay to feel, but you gotta feel fast and you gotta learn from the failure, right? So you it's very important. Like for me, the old school mentality of you have to know everything, you can't admit when you're doing wrong, that's kind of that's kind of fizzled out now. And the new way of running plants or running or being a leader is more about learning from what do we feel at, like how could we have done this better, or what skills do you need to fill. And you should have, as new grad, just make sure that my advice would be to make sure that your boss is willing to commit the time to coach and mentor and develop you as a leader.
Do you mind me asking, in the case, what if you don't find that your mentor or your leader does have the time? What would be a recommendation?
Well, that's a really good question. So and I'd have to think about my in my life. So I would say, one, you either start looking for a mentor outside of the organization who you can rely on to help coach you through the situations you're having at work. If you can't find anyone outside of it, then I would honestly start looking for another company where you know that you can go in there and get mentored. And that's, maybe it's a bit of a controversial view, but I would always advise for people leaving university or college or school, I would try and get into a bigger organization, because typically, and not all the time, but typically the bigger organizations have a ton of support networks and a ton of resources that you can collaborate with. And certainly it's been the case in my career so far. Is the most that I've learned, well, I guess, yeah, the most I've learned have been from the larger organizations. So that would be my advice, is if there's students leaving, to try, at least try and get into a bigger organization where there's a really good development plan in place.
If I'm not mistaken, a lot of these larger organizations do have formal education programs within that you can learn different skills and such.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Yeah, no, definitely that would be a good recommendation. I mean, on one hand, if you go into a small company, you get in the thick of it, which can be one way you can learn a lot very fast from
Mhm.
in the moment, but then at the same time having a formal education can be also much
Right.
can be very good. One of the things that you have come up, we have mentioned the word, is leadership and such. And one of the themes that I came across when I was doing research on you was that you like to follow servant leadership. And that's
Right.
actually a new term for me. So I'd love to know, A, what is it? And B, how did you develop that type of philosophy?
So it's really interesting because now, it's you'll see this term pop up a lot more, and I think it's been around since the 1970s. So there was a gentleman in the States, I think his name was Robert Greenleaf, and he coined the phrase servant leadership. So basically, what it is in a nutshell is it kind of the it kind of changes the tables or turns the tables on the traditional style of what a leader is. So traditionally, sorry, a leader is the whole team focuses around the leader. So the leader is more of, you're directing everything. All the decisions are made by a leader, and then everyone below the leader just goes along with it, and they're comfortable in it. So if you think about, I was actually, when I know that we were having this conversation, I was looking at some kind of reference material, and
Mm-hmm.
there was a YouTuber that was, I think I like the way he described it. He's like the traditional leadership. If you think about it in terms of modern society, so Downton Abbey in the TV program, if you think about Downton Abbey, you had the head of the household, and then obviously you had the servants who served the leader, and they were all the servant galleys and all the kitchens were downstairs, so it was right below. And for me, it was a really good visualization because that's exactly what the old school or the traditional leadership mentality is. With servant leadership, the new way of thinking is the first, in a nutshell, your first role should always be to serve and then to lead. And that's why it says servant leadership. So it's definitely more heavily focused on listening first and then making decisions. So if I were to put it in a real context in my everyday life, my servant leadership mentality is a ton of active listening. So when I come in the morning and I chat with my teams, I'm asking how's it going, any support that you need, any challenges that we need to address right away. So when you go into an environment like that, your team feels like they're being listened to, but they also feel like you're not really dictating to them what has to happen. There's times when you have to. There's times when, as a plant manager, you have to make a decision and you and your team have to follow it. But generally, a servant leader will get the team together. They'll ask for their opinion. They'll ask for their advice, and then they'll make a decision based on that. So it's really it's really making sure that your team feels safe enough to make good decisions, and also really on when it gets down to the production floor level, the a servant leader will always try to remove any of the obstacles that are in the way of creating success for a team. For instance, in my role, if we have machine operators or supervisors that are constantly battling a piece of equipment that's always failing, or there's something that's not working, your role as a servant leader is to make sure that that obstacle is taken out of the way or is fixed, or we have a good program in place to make sure that it never happens again. And so that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of what a servant leader should be doing.
I really like that. I think that's a really it's a more progressive way of looking at things, but it also feels that it creates a better, and I like that you were use the word safe, a safe environment, because when people don't feel safe working, and not literally, and well, of course, literally and figuratively, that can lead to, of course, people getting hurt first and foremost if they don't feel safe, but as well, really just growing together and being able, because I know you mentioned about another thing that's important to you is, continuous improvement and such. But if someone doesn't feel safe, they won't speak up, and maybe they are the individual who might have the idea to make something better, but if they don't feel safe, they're not going to say anything.
Right, so the term you'll hear more often now is psychological safety, and so there's many organizations that focus a lot on that now because it has been proven that if your team feels safe to make mistakes and learn from them, then you're going to build a better organization. And to give another example of where I first seen the effects of psychological safety was when I was working so I worked for a large dairy company called Agripur, and one of the leaders there, we had a we had an issue in one of the manufacturing plants, and it was it was significant enough to have a lot of senior leaders descend onto the plant. But in previous roles that I had with other companies, you know, the mentality that I witnessed was, if there's a problem or there's a plant that's not reaching its goals or there's an issue, typically the plant manager would he'd either get the boot or the senior, the director or the vice president would come in and say, "What the heck are you guys doing? You need to get better," or they would say that this manager's not working out, so he's going to get fired. But what I witnessed there was, it was a gentleman called Benoit Solnay, and he was a senior vice president at the time. And I was a young manager, so I didn't really have a lot of skin in the game at the time. But we had a significant enough issue, and when the team descended on the plant, the first thing I was expecting, he was going to come into the room and just rain hellfire on everyone. And the first thing he said to the whole team in the boardroom was, "What support do you need? So where can we help? What do you guys need?" And it was a total game changer for me. And at that moment, I had realized that that's exactly what a servant leader does. So they don't flash their position, they don't veto, they don't dictate, but the first comment should always be, "What support do you need?" And so that was what kind of kickstarted my growth in servant leader. And I loved the fact that there was many senior people around that boardroom table and operators and supervisors. And the first thing that he said was, "What support? What do you guys need? What support do you need?" So that definitely really started my passion in the term servant leadership.
Wow. It's so great that you had that experience early on too, just to see it in action and seeing, actions speak louder. Well, obviously they were saying something, but the action of saying, "What can
Right.
we do to support you?" really became a pivotal moment. And I could imagine that, like you said, it really shifted how you approached being in plant being a leader.
Yeah, and that's the thing as well is, if I wasn't in that position, Agripur, they're one of the biggest dairy companies in Canada, and internationally they're quite significant as well. So if I wasn't in that position and I wasn't in that big organization, I think it would have taken me a lot longer to learn that skill. Whereas if you're in a big organization and you have these senior leaders that come in, you know, for me, I was just a sponge, so I just absorbed everything. I reached out to people, I absorbed all that they were communicating, how they're communicating, what they were teaching us. So, and typically in a large organization, if you're willing to just absorb it, it's a good starting point.
Amazing. And, speaking to that, because we have the audience, we've spoke about active listening, asking for support and all that, but maybe we could expand that a little bit more if you were to be giving advice. We can even go into tangible skills. What skills and qualities would you say would be essential for someone aspiring to be a plant manager?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a realist, so you have to be good with the numbers. So you're as a plant manager, you have a couple of responsibilities. Number one, obviously, you have responsibility for making sure your team feel feel safe and they are developing and they have guidance and a clear path to success. But number two, as a plant manager, you have to be good with numbers. So you have to make sure that you understand what is what is driving profitability for the plant, but also where all your key metrics and how you're performing. So for instance, in this role, but also in other roles, you have to know what your labor metrics, how much are you spending on labor, how much how much does it cost for you to make your products. So in the salad industry, it's we call it bowls. So how much does it cost to make a bowl of salad? In the dairy industry, it's a pallet of milk. So I think the tangible is you have to be good with the numbers. You have to understand your financial metrics. And then once you have a good understanding of what drives those, then you have to have a good team that are going to be able to make improvements on those metrics. So, for instance, now typically around September, October time, manufacturing plants will start to develop their strategic plans for next year. So, me and in my role, we know what's driving the plant, the financial metrics of the plant. So now I'm starting to develop my strategic plan for next year. So I'll bring in my all my managers, I'll bring them in and say, okay, next year we need to improve, we need to reduce overtime, or we need to improve the efficiency of the packaging lines by 5%. So in the next month or two, we have to figure out what timelines and how are we going to achieve increasing efficiencies. So I would let the manager start working on that. So yeah, so I'm not too sure. Hopefully I answered the question, but at a high level, you have to be good in numbers. You have to understand what's driving those numbers in a plant, and then you have to have the ability, or your team has to have the ability of correcting it. If the numbers aren't looking good, your team needs to know how to correct it and how to plan on correcting it. But then you also have to make sure your team are on the right path.
No, you definitely answered the question, because although we do have these podcasts, we have the stories you talk about, the soft skills, the listening and all that. There's also, like you said, the reality that you have to be good at the more tangible, the hard skills, the in your case, it would be the maths and all that. And it's just
Right.
making me think, I'm like, do courses or programs that maybe focus on plant management, now I'm thinking they better have some financial type courses, and to be for individuals to understand just adding numbers, looking at projections, trends, because that's very important.
Yeah, and so we done when I done my food science degree, there was an element to that. So there was business kind of fundamentals but really for a manufacturing plant where I gained, like if you look at it from a hierarchy standpoint, as a supervisor, you're in charge of running your shift. So like morning shift, afternoon shift. So you're responsible for reporting the efficiencies of each production line. You're responsible for making sure your team are in on time, they've clocked in on time. You're kind of managing overtime. So as a supervisor, your level of responsibility is focused on the shift level. And then as a production manager, you're focused more like on the weekly performance of the plant. And then as a plant manager, you're focused on what drives all those different metrics. So it's interesting because you get a lot of experience as a supervisor, and then that kind of helps you to get into a role of production manager. And then all the stuff you learn as a production manager in your actual sector, then that should propel you in a position where you can go into a plant manager role. Because typically, unless you're a superstar candidate, typically you don't go in from university right into a plant manager role.
I hope I haven't been confusing the terms again. I know with different size companies, a plant, there's only one facility, so you end up being the production manager and the plant manager. So I hope I haven't been misspeaking there, but that's the understanding I have too, because it's would be difficult to come in as a plant and become a plant manager as well. There's so much more to it. You have the tangible skills, but then as well those soft skills, and it might be a little difficult for someone young coming in right out of school and then all of a sudden leading. It might not always work out the best.
Right. And if you look at it as well, so in 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 a typical manufacturing plant, you will have, so the plant manager, and the kind of difference is obviously they have full site responsibility. So they have full signing authority, full responsibility. And then when you break it up into the certain sectors, like a production manager, their responsibility is to their production supervisors and their production team. So anything where that involves producing the product, washing or packaging or whatever you have, they're typically responsible for just their small sector team. Yeah, and then the plant manager, obviously, the plant manager is responsible for the quality manager, the warehouse manager, the production manager. So it's just a higher level of responsibility.
Okay. Okay. So I'm keeping track of the time in that, and we're getting there's again it's always these episodes are too short for me. There's so many things that I want to dive into because there's so many great things that we could speak about, but I just wanted to take a last few minutes to quickly talk about continuous improvement and such, because it blends well with what we were speaking to, the numbers and such. And one thing I was curious about is just how you approach continuous improvement. Like okay, I'm going to take this back so I have a better defined question, because that's a loaded phrase right there. So
Yeah.
let's just say that you're looking to improve the efficiency of a production line, one particular line, and we want to use the word continuous improvement. What might be some of the things that you take into consideration if you wanted to choose what option to improve this particular production line?
So that's a really great question. And so now I feel like I'm in a job interview, but so continuous improvement. So first and foremost, just to go back to the core, the continuous improvement's been around for 60, 70, 80 years, and it was first kind of really started by the Toyota car company. And if you boil it down to the roots, it was after World War II. Obviously, Japan in an island, they were trying to rebuild their country, and Toyota had a really challenging time because they were on an island. They were trying to ship cars all over the world. So, you could probably imagine after World Wars, it gets pretty expensive to run a manufacturing facility. So they
Mm-hmm.
they had to start developing how to improve, how to get more efficient. And so that's where they started working on continuous improvement. And companies in North America and the Western world, when they say continuous improvement, they bring in teams that are okay. We have to continuously improve, and it's they're looking for we have to improve in 1 or 2 or 5 years time. Toyota, it's taken Toyota 60, 70 years to develop this continuous improvement methodology. So to me, getting back to your question, how do we improve a line here or an average day? You have to start with data. So you have to start what's the current state. So currently, is this machine running 100 pieces per minute? What is it What is it built to run? Is it built to run 160 pieces a minute? So then you have real data that you can achieve. So you've got, for instance, if you have to achieve 50 units a minute more, then you start working with your team, the operators on the floor, the people who are experts in running that equipment on the floor. You start working with them and going, okay, guys, what areas of this packaging equipment do we need to start working on so we can increase the efficiency of the machine? And the operators will typically, they'll start listing off a whole bunch of items, and those items they start listing off are ones that have really annoyed them. So for long-term employees that have been with companies for 10 or 15 years, they'll start listing off different parts of the equipment that haven't been fixed in years, and we just run it now, and that's the way it's always been. And so those things, as a servant leader, those things are the items that you should be fixing. And so to increase efficiency, you go and talk to the real experts who run the equipment, and you say, okay, we need to increase this packaging line by 50 jugs a minute more. And how are we going to do it? So then you start doing it in bite-sized chunks. If we make an adjustment on this conveyor line, it's going to increase by half a jug a minute or whatever you have. And so you start doing really small changes. And if you really boil it down, for me, I am in no way an expert in continuous improvement. I have a passion for it, and
Mm-hmm.
I have really seen the benefits in my work for it. It's if you boil it down, you have to be you have to ask yourself, are we better? And I always say this to my teams, are we better than yesterday or are we better than last year? So if we have a line that runs at 80% efficiency, I always say to the team, okay, are we better than last year? What were we running last year? And they go, well, we were at 72% last year. Okay, that's continuous improvement. We're better. So that's one element of how to increase efficiency, but also is the key for me is it's small incremental changes. So continuous improvement is not about these massive, like we could spend $6-7 million with a brand new packaging line and we can install it and it could run way faster than what we currently do. But that's not the intent of continuous improvement. That's just you're just investing money on you're just spending money on bringing in new equipment. Continuous improvement should be okay, we have the current equipment we have, and in the current processes, how do we make the process more efficient and how do we eliminate all the waste in a production line?
Okay. Well, I love that. And it just brings to mind, I think of, if anyone's aware of the author James Clear, he has the saying on Atomic Habits, it's 1% better every day. So not only does it apply to, manufacturing, but just yourself too. You don't have to overhaul your whole life in one day. Incremental bits are much more sustainable as well because you can go at a slower pace.
Right, exactly.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to leave that there because unfortunately we are at the end of our time. So thank you so much, Gavin, for taking time to come on the show. I'm so happy I was able to have you come and talk about what you do. And finally, I got that plant manager on, and I hope that this really inspires some individuals who are listening.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It feels like we just started talking.
That's what I was thinking. I'm looking at the clock and I went, where'd the whole time go?
Yeah, yeah, it's been awesome, and looking forward to hearing back the podcast.
Thank you everyone so much for listening to episode 78 of the Food Grads podcast. All the notes of this podcast can be found on the Food Grads website and by clicking on the Student and Grads tab on the homepage. There you can find any notes to past or future episodes. Is there anyone you would like us to interview in the show? Perhaps yourself? Or maybe there's a certain career path you would like us to explore, then let us know. You can email me at veronica.hislop, HISLOP, @foodgrads.com, or reach out on any of our social media channels. I can't believe I managed to get to 78 episodes on this podcast and have never interviewed a plant manager. Not sure how that happened, but Gavin was a great individual to speak to in order to break that streak. It sounds like being a plant manager is a massive balancing act. For example, you need to balance the needs of the day-to-day with the plans of the year-to-year. But not only that, you have to balance hitting key performance markers to keep upper management happy, but you also have to keep those that work for you happy as well. So managing those interpersonal relationships. And because of this, I've always thought that individuals who are plant managers are just quite amazing, frankly, like simply put. Though prior to speaking to Gavin, I had never heard of the term servant leadership. But you know what? I really like that approach to things, putting people first and supporting them so you can raise everyone up together. But again, being a plant manager sounds like a tough job, and I commend anyone who's able to do that, like Gavin. Though reflecting back on this episode, I think that Gavin's advice is something that can be applied for everyone. And it's something that can be applied to all types of managers. Always be open to learning. Always be curious, always pay attention to everything that's going on around you, and of course, ask questions. Anyways, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you everyone so much for listening, and I will see you next time.